First thing I remember is the sound beneath the hull, like wet leather drawn slow over stone. The night air had been still, yet the sea around my kayak shivered. My hands numbed on the paddle shaft. The water beside me bulged without breaking, as if something breathed just below the skin. Then the surface opened soundlessly, and two pale, lidless eyes looked up from the black. Men have asked me to recount this, though I am an old man and my tongue grows slow. If this account holds your interest, leave some small mark, a word or sign, so that those who seek such tales may gather here and be counted. It began 3 weeks earlier, on the 15th day of the moon, in the summer of the year that the Russian priests would later call 1500. We had put our kayaks into the cold water off the south shore of Unimak, where the surf lies heavy and the fog clings low to the black sand. I was a younger man then, my hair still dark, my shoulders sound. My name is not important. Among our people, I was known for a steady stroke and a careful eye, and that was why I went with them. There were 4 of us. Old Tatkek led our small party, for he had hunted walrus and whale since the time my father was a boy. His eyes were pale from the years, his face cut with fine lines like the grain of driftwood, yet his hands upon the paddle were still sure. With him came Siku, who was nearest to me in age, quick with laughter, fond of song, and too fond of boasting. The last was Nulik, broad-shouldered and quiet, who said little and listened much. His wife had given birth to a son that spring, and he carried the memory of the child's small weight in his arms, even as he pulled on the paddle. We put out from the village before dawn, while the stars still burned faint above the low roof of cloud. The air held that sharp taste of salt and cold iron that comes when the ice has gone, but winter has not wholly loosened its grip. Our kayaks were skin on frame, seal hide stretched tight over the bent ribs of driftwood, seams rubbed with oil so no water might leak through. Each man carried his throwing board, his harpoons with boneheads and bladder floats neatly coiled, his seal club, and a small pouch of dried fish. In my cockpit, wedged behind my back, lay the tobacco that I had traded from a man who had known the first Russian ship. Tatkek kept us in a line abreast at first, his paddle dipping with that slow, even rhythm that could carry a man through a day and leave him still with strength for the landing. We followed the sweep of the coast, keeping the dark line of the cliffs upon our left hand. The basalt rose there in weathered columns, streaked with guano, the cries of nesting birds drifting out over the grey water. At first, there was nothing strange. The swell was long and even, the sea that flat iron colour that takes no light into it. We saw the backs of sea lions rolling, the spouts of distant whales, the low flash as a salmon turned under the surface. The air was full of the ordinary sounds of that country, the creak of our lashings, the small gurgle of water along the hulls, the wing beats of moories. We had set out to seek bearded seal beyond the point, where the shoals fall away into deep water. The summer had been lean, the ice poor, and men spoke in the houses of thin faces when the long night came. There were stories, too, of something that had taken a kayak off the west side of Unalaska the winter before. But such tales were common in storm seasons, and we did not give them much weight. It is easier to blame the sea spirits than one's own carelessness. Toward midday, the wind freshened a little from the east. I remember that because it raised a smell from the cliffs, damp stone, rotting kelp, and the sour musk of sea lions hauled upon some hidden ledge. Siku called across to me, his voice bright over the water. "When we return," he said, "I will make my son another toy kayak. He has already broken the first with his wild voyages upon the floor." I laughed and told him that perhaps he should first fashion one for his own use, for I had seen the way he scraped his hull upon the stones. Nulik smiled at that, though he did not speak. For a little time we spoke of such things, of children, of the strength of our wives, of tobacco, which was rare then. I passed the pouch to Tatkek when we drifted together, and he took a small pinch, working it in his teeth, his eyes half closed. "Young men," he said, "spend their tongue like water. There is time yet for talk when the hunt is done." Those were easy moments when the world seemed known and bounded by shore, sky, and the reach of a good paddle. Had I understood what waited beyond the point, I might have turned my bow home then. But understanding is a thing that comes late and without mercy. The first strangeness came with sound. As we rounded the black headland at the south of the island, the sea grew deeper, the colour turning from iron to that darker blue that drinks the light. The cliffs drew back, and the coast fell into a long curve of open water. Here the swell always rose, and the current pulled strong to the west. We let the kayaks rise and fall, our paddles working with the water, not against it. Then, beneath the murmur of waves, I heard something else. It was faint at first, so faint that I wondered if it lay only within my skull. A slow, pulsing note, deep and regular, like the beat of a drum muffled in snow. It came through the hull, through my bones, rather than through the air. I paused, letting my kayak drift, and the sound ceased. When I dipped my paddle again, it returned. I looked to the others. Nulik had his head bent, a small frown between his brows, as if he too heard something he did not name. Siku only paddled on, humming a hunting song. Old Tatkek's face showed nothing but the customary sternness. "Do you hear that?" I asked, when the distance between our kayaks allowed. "Hear what?" Siku called back. "The sea beneath us," I said. He laughed. "The sea has always spoken, friend. It tells you that you are not as strong as you boast." Yet as we pushed farther from the shelter of the headland, the sound grew more distinct. It was not the groan of ice, for there was no ice upon that water, nor the call of any whale I had ever heard. It seemed to move beneath us, ahead of us, then behind, though the water above remained smooth. Once, for a heartbeat, it shifted into a slow rising whistle, almost like a man's voice heard through heavy sleep. Only later did I learn that the elders named such voices Palraijuk when they spoke among themselves, but at that time no one used that word. The second sign came not long after, and if the sound had been easy to dismiss, this was less so. We followed a loose line of foam where the currents met, watching for the dark ovals of seal heads. We found instead a trail. It lay upon the surface as if some great creature had passed not above the water, but just beneath, disturbing the slick. It ran parallel to our course for the length of 4 kayak lengths at least, a furrowed path where the usual calm sheen was broken into narrow, wavering lines. On either side, the sea lay untroubled. The width of that hidden track was wrong. Too broad for seal or sea lion, too even for the tail of any whale. It had the look of something long and low that moved with purpose. We all saw it. Even Siku fell silent as we drifted nearer, our paddles still, and the only sound was the small, hollow knock as our hulls touched. The trail ended as sharply as if cut with a knife. No bubbling, no spume, no sign of rising or sinking. "A tide rip," Siku said at last, though the word held more hope than belief. "The tide does not forget itself so quickly," muttered Tatkek. Nulik dipped his hand into the disturbed water, his fingers spreading. "It is colder here," he said. "Feel." I reached in. He spoke truth. The sea along that trail bit at my skin, a cold that felt like the shadow of winter lying along a single narrow road through the summer water. We said little of it, because men who hunt upon the sea learn early that fear is a thing best stamped upon with a hard heel. We turned our kayaks away and set ourselves once more to the work of the day. There were seals to find, and the stomach has little patience for invisible tracks. As the sun climbed higher behind the thin cloud, the world grew oddly quiet. The farther we rode along that southern curve, the more the usual cries of birds fell away. There were no wheeling gulls, no black shapes of cormorants upon the rocks, no low murmur of auklet flocks. The air itself seemed to thicken in my ears. At first, I welcomed the silence, for it made the water seem broad and undisturbed. But as the hours passed, it took on another quality, one that made the hairs upon my forearms lift against my skin clothing. The only sounds were the dip and draw of our paddles and the small hiss of water along the hulls. It was as if the whole coast held its breath. Once I turned my head to seek the familiar thin line of plover along the sand. There were none. Not even the distant bark of a lone fox came off the dunes. I did not speak of it, but I saw Nulik's gaze rove the empty sky in that same uneasy manner. Old Tatkek kept his face forward, his jaw set. By the time the sun slid behind the low cloak of cloud, turning the world into a dim grey bowl, the air had grown colder by several breaths. I felt it upon my cheeks and in the tightening of my fingers upon the paddle shaft. The chill was not that of evening. It fell upon us in a slow, steady descent, as if we had paddled from summer into late autumn in the span of an hour. "We will camp upon the next sheltered beach," Tatkek called. His voice had lost some of its former harshness. There is no gain in hunting when the sea hides all sign. We landed upon a crescent of coarse sand, black and glittering, set between two hunched shoulders of volcanic rock. There was driftwood enough for a small fire, and above the tide line, amid tumbled stones, we found tracks. They wound along the shore, then down toward the water. At first, I took them for the trails of sea lions, for they had that same double-grooved pattern made by the body dragging between flippers. Yet these were longer, deeper. When I set my booted foot within one, my toes did not reach the front. The width of each mark was almost to my knee. Siku knelt and touched the edges. "There," he said, pointing. "That is the mark of a flipper. But here, see how it drags. As if it carried not only its own weight, but the weight of something clinging to it. The sand at the bottom of the grooves held a faint shine, as if something slimy had passed. When I pressed my fingers there, they came away with a thin, clear mucus that smelled faintly of fish, and something older, like stone turned long in the deep. Perhaps a great sea lion, I said, driven ashore by sickness. Perhaps, Nulik answered, though his eyes did not leave the track. But why then do we see no blood, no hair, no sign of struggle? See how it enters the water and does not return. The trail did indeed vanish cleanly at the line where the waves reached. it did not break into the confusion that comes when surf tugs at disturbed sand. It simply ceased, as if whatever made it had taken to the water with no more effort than a man walking from house to house. That was the first trace that set my heart to beating in that slow, heavy way that is not yet fear, but something very near to it. We built a small fire from the driftwood and the dried stalks of beach rye, though the smoke went up only a little way before flattening under the dense, chill air. As darkness came down, the far line of the sea vanished. It was as if our small ring of light hung alone in a vast, hollow space. We sat close to the fire, our kayaks pulled up beyond the reach of the tide, hatches turned toward the shore in case we had to launch swiftly. The skins of the boats gleamed dully in the shifting light, their bone lashings and ivory toggles throwing back small, cold glints. It was there, with the smoke in our eyes and the warmth stealing only slowly into our cold hands, that we spoke again of home. Siku drew from his belt the small ivory figure he had carved for his son, rough still, with one hand of the tiny man yet unshaped. He turned it in his fingers, and his usual laughter was quiet. He sleeps beside his mother with his hand in her hair, Nulik said, staring into the flames. He will take my place by the lamp if I never return. She is strong, but it is easy to be strong when one does not know how a man may die. Tutkek spat tobacco juice into the sand. Men have always gone out and not returned. The sea keeps her share. Thinking of it will not change her hunger. I passed the tobacco pouch, and each of them took a small portion. We chewed in silence for a time, tasting that bitter comfort. Those moments by the fire have stayed with me as clearly as the later horrors, perhaps because they were the last when we were truly ourselves. It was in the depth of that night that the sea first spoke clearly. I took the first watch, sitting with my back to my kayak, my spear across my knees, the fire at my right hand, the open water before me. The stars were veiled by a thin mist, and the sea lay black and wide, broken only by a pale path where the swell ran up against some underwater rise. The others slept behind me, their breathing a low, steady murmur. After a time, I heard it, a sound that was not wind, though the night was very still. It came first as a distant sigh, like breath drawn through a long throat. Then, slowly, it shaped itself into something that could almost be called a voice. It rose and fell in long, low moans that seemed to come from far out upon the dark water. The notes did not follow any pattern I knew. They were not the courting songs of whales, which I had heard many times, nor the barking of sea lions, nor the cries of birds. They were too slow, too heavy, with spaces between that stretched my nerves tight. Several times the sound rose in pitch until it hovered just below the level of human speech, then dropped again into that chest-deep realm that made my ribs vibrate. Once, for perhaps 5 heartbeats, I had the mad impression that it was repeating a shape, as if trying to copy the pattern of our own voices from some great distance. I told myself that it was only a whale, some stranger from the open ocean, and that my mind, shaped by the tracks and the earlier pulsing, gave it a human character it did not possess. I told myself this many times. Still, I woke Tutkek when his watch came, and I did not speak of the noises. There is a kind of shame in admitting that you fear what lies beyond the known, especially when no clear danger shows itself. By the 3rd day, the small things began to fail us. It started with Nulik's throwing board. We were off a low chain of rocks that rose from the sea like the backs of sleeping beasts when he steadied himself to cast at a seal. As he set the butt of the spear into the block, the leather thong that held it cracked cleanly in two. His hand jerked, the spear slipped, and the heavy bonehead plunged straight down into the water with barely a splash. He swore under his breath, a quick, fierce word, and snatched at the braided line, but his fingers closed on nothing. The harpoon line, which should have followed the spear into the water like a living thing, remained coiled at his feet, neatly bound. The spear had gone without it, as if the line had never been tied. We all saw it. The coil lay there, its end tucked under itself, fat and undisturbed. For a long breath, we stared at it in silence. Then Siku gave a short, strained laugh. "You forgot to tie it," he said. "You grow clumsy, friend." Nulik said nothing. Slowly, he bent, lifted the coil, and tugged its free end. The leather slid cleanly through his hand. The final knot at the spearhead had been severed with a precision no clumsy fingers could achieve. That was the first microfracture in the shell of our certainty. We had counted on our skill and our gear as one counts upon the shape of the land. To see it fail in such a manner opened a narrow space for other thoughts to slip in. By the fourth day, the absences grew more marked. In a small cove where there had always been rafts of otter playing, the water lay empty. On a reef that customarily held seals by the dozen, we found only the pale shapes of bones, cleaned and piled as if by human hands. A flock of kittiwakes that had wheeled above a certain cliff each summer. Long before my birth were gone, leaving only streaks of old guano and the low hiss of wind. Once, late in the afternoon, we passed a floating log that should have been crowded with resting cormorants. It bore only the marks of their claws and a thick smear of the same clear, faintly gleaming mucus we had seen in the beach tracks. The wood under that slime had been rasped, the grain torn as if by many small, sharp teeth. It was around this time that the smell began. We were paddling past a narrow mouth in the cliff, a shallow cave that I knew from boyhood. In my youth, I had hidden there with other boys, our kayaks pulled up on the stony floor while we told tales. It had always smelled of salt, old kelp, and the dry dust of volcanic rock. As we passed, a new scent rolled out over the water. It was not the simple rot of dead fish or the musk of seal. It had in it those notes, but bound together by something heavier, a sour, sweet taint that hooked behind the nose and would not easily be shaken free. It was like the breath from a deep crevasse in the winter ice, where something old has lain frozen for a long time and now begins to thaw. The others smelled it too. I saw their lips pull back a little, as if the taste of it lay upon their tongues. Nulik spat into the sea. Siku muttered a short prayer, the first I had heard from him since we set out. "Leave it," Tatkek said, his voice flat. "There is no good thing in that cave now." We obeyed. Yet as we paddled on, the scent seemed to cling to us, woven into the fibers of our clothing, nay, the seams of the kayaks. I tasted it again that night when I took a piece of dried fish from my pouch, and for the first time in my life upon the sea, I found that I could not swallow. On the 6th day, we saw the first partial shape. The morning had come in with a thick fog, the kind that lies low upon the water and hides even the nearest rock. We tied our kayaks together by short lengths of line, bow to stern, so that no man might slip away unseen. The world shrank to a small grey dome, our line of 4 boats the only solid thing within it. Sound changed in that fog. It came muffled, close, as if the air itself had turned to wet wool. We moved slowly, listening for the crash of hidden rocks, the break of surf. Our paddles dipped almost without sound. Somewhere far off, a whale breathed, its exhalation a faint, ghostly sigh. Then, off to our right, something else moved the water. It was subtle at first, a slow lifting of the surface, a swelling that did not belong to any swell or wave. The fog swirled, revealing only a pale bulge in the greyness, then closing again. The line between us and that disturbance could have been measured in perhaps 8 paddle lengths. "Hold," Tatkek whispered, though we had already fallen still. I felt the pull of the thing as it passed, a low, steady drag that tugged at the hull beneath me. The water slid along its hidden sides, making a faint, continuous hiss. Then, as if some unseen fin cut the surface from within, a long, narrow ridge broke through the skin of the sea. It showed for only a heartbeat before the fog swallowed it again, but in that heartbeat I saw smooth, pale flesh, mottled with grey patches like old ice. Along its length ran a line of irregular knobs, each the size of a man's head, and between those knobs, shallow pits like empty eye sockets. There was no dorsal fin, no fluke, no familiar curve of back or spine. It passed parallel to us, its length unknowable, for the front and back remained veiled. Siku made a raw, soft sound in his throat, half curse, half prayer. Nolik gripped the sides of his cockpit so hard that the skin creaked. My own breath came short and fast. We had all seen whales before, even the long, strange ribbonfish that sometimes drifted in from the outer sea. This was not of that kind. As it drew level with us, the sound beneath the hulls rose again, that slow, pulsing thrum that I had first felt upon our entry into these waters. It matched the movement of the shape, as if the two were one, body and voice travelling together through the deep. Then, just as it came abreast of my own kayak, something knocked against us from below. The blow was not hard enough to capsize, but it was sudden, sharp and precise, as if something long and narrow had struck us with intent. The lashings groaned, the kayaks jolted, and for an instant the line between us strained tight. My paddle slipped from my hands. It should have floated there beside me, for the wood was dry and light. I snatched for it, fingers closing on empty air. I looked around in a quick, jerking circle. The paddle was gone. No splash had marked its fall. No dark shape showed beneath the surface. It was as if the sea had opened a mouth and taken it whole. That was our small shock, the quick tearing of the everyday veil. In that moment, something in me shifted. The sea had ceased to be merely broad and mysterious. It had become watchful. We drifted there in the fog, our little cluster of kayaks swaying. Old Tatkek's face was grey as the air around us. His eyes, usually so sharp, seemed suddenly very old. "We turn back," he said at last. "There is no more hunting here." No one argued. Even Siku, whose pride had borne him into many foolish places, only nodded, his lips pressed tight. We turned our bows, slowly, careful not to rock the fragile skins too much, careful not to dip the paddles too deep. The journey homeward was no simple retreat. It was a slow sinking into a different world, where each ordinary thing carried a new and uneasy meaning. The fog did not lift that day, nor the next. It wrapped us in its clammy embrace, droplets beading upon our hoods, as our lashes, the curved bows of the kayaks. Sounds came from odd directions. A splash that should have been behind us seemed to leap to our left. Once, I heard my own paddle stroke return to my ears as if from some great height above. At night, on the small beaches where we dragged our kayaks ashore, the strange calls came closer. That pulsing undernote grew stronger, joined at times by a scraping, grinding sound, like stone on bone. More than once, as I lay with my head upon the rolled skin clothing that served me for a pillow, I felt a faint vibration through the ground, as if something moved along the seabed just beyond the shore. The seals, when we saw them at all, were nervous. They surfaced near us with jerking motions, their whiskers slick against their rounded cheeks, their eyes rolling wildly. Twice I saw one vanish in a sudden swirl of foam, not diving of its own accord, but pulled under. Each time a cloud of that faintly gleaming mucus rose to the surface, spread and thinned. On the 8th night, as we huddled around a meager fire of damp wood, the thing came nearest. The fog had thickened further, so that even the glow of our flames seemed to hang only a hand's breadth from the coals before fading into grey. We had set our kayaks wheelwise, forming a loose circle around the fire, their prows inward like the points of a broken crown. Beyond them, the sea was only a sound, the slow lap of small waves upon the stones. We spoke little. The muscles of my arms ached from paddling. My mouth tasted always of that saucy smell. Nulik carved at a scrap of driftwood, his knife moving by habit rather than purpose. Siku stared into the flames, the half-made toy figure lying forgotten in his palm. Tatkek had covered his head with his parka hood, his breath coming in small, visible puffs. It was then that the sea fell utterly silent. The small slap of wave on stone ceased. The distant hiss of surf against some hidden reef went away. Even the dull, constant murmur that is always present where water meets land faded. The world drew in on itself until there was only the sound of our own hearts in our ears. I did not at first understand what had left us. Only when Siku raised his head slowly, his eyes wide, did the absence press upon me. The sea does not rest. Even in the quietest bay, there is always some small movement. But now it lay as a held breath. Into that stillness came a new sound, a soft, wet sliding, like heavy flesh drawn over loose stones. It came from just beyond the ring of our upturned kayaks, circling us, slow and deliberate. The hairs on the back of my neck rose. My hand crept toward my spear. The sliding passed behind me, then to my left, then back again, as if some vast body moved there, just at the edge of our thin light. Once, it paused. I heard a faint, irregular tapping, like claws or teeth testing the hull of one of the kayaks. The skin there creaked with the pressure. "Do not move," Tatkek whispered from within his hood. His voice was barely more than the movement of air. The thing answered not with sound, but with touch. The stones under my feet shifted, a slow settling as if weight had come upon them. A chill rose through the soles of my boots, up my legs, into my belly. The smell came then, heavy and close, that sour Thoringus odor, thick enough to taste. It filled my nose, my throat, my lungs. My stomach lurched. Something brushed against the back of my hand, very lightly. The contact was cold and slick, yet beneath that skin there was a firmness, a contained strength. My fingers jerked away of their own accord. I bit down on a cry. That contact lasted no more than a breath, but in that breath a portion of my old self went out of me. I knew then, in a way that needed no words, that whatever moved there could reach us if it wished, that our fire, our spears, our careful seam-stitching were like children's tricks before it. After a time, the sliding moved away, the loose stones settling back. The smell thinned, though it did not entirely leave. The ordinary sounds of the sea returned, first a faint tick of wave, then the low breath of swell upon shore. We did not sleep that night, though some of us closed our eyes. I sat with my back to my kayak, spear upright between my knees, and listened to the sea shift and roll. My thoughts had grown strangely still. There was fear in me, but it had shed its sharp edges. What remained was a kind of flat certainty that we had crossed into a place where understanding must be set aside. We launched at first light, though the light was only a lifting of darkness into a paler grey. Each man moved with care, mindful of the unseen weight that had passed so near. The fog had thinned a little, enough that we could see the line of the cliffs once more, though their details were softened, made vague. As we rounded a small rocky point, I saw that the usual colony of seabirds there had not returned. Instead, upon the upper ledge where they had nested, the rock bore fresh markings. Long, curving gouges scored the basalt in sets of 3 and 4, each mark as long as my forearm. The stone at the base of those grooves had been worn smooth and pale, as if rubbed many times by something hard and wet. We did not tarry there. Our paddles rose and fell in a new rhythm, more urgent, less measured. The muscles in my shoulders burned. My hands had begun to crack and bleed at the knuckles, the salt water biting at those small wounds. It was on the 10th day, as we approached the longest sweep of shore that led toward home, that the thing chose to show itself fully. The sea had calmed. The fog had at last begun to shred, opening ragged windows of clearer air through which we glimpsed patches of sky, the dull color of bone. The water here was shallower, a softer green, with the pale blur of sand visible far below. For a little time, the ordinariness of it lulled us. I remember that Siku even tried a joke, though his voice lacked its old strength. "Perhaps it has grown bored with us," he said. "Perhaps it prefers the taste of Russian sailors with all their iron." No one answered him. Our silence swallowed his words like the sea had taken my paddle. The swell lifted us, then set us down. Lifted, set down. The motion had become so familiar that I no longer marked it. Then, without warning, it changed. A long, slow rise came under us, deeper and more powerful than any wave. My kayak tilted, not with the round rolling motion of natural swell, but as if the very bottom of the sea rose beneath us in a single deliberate flexion. The others cried out, brief, startled exclamations. Water slipped between our hulls as they were pushed apart. Ahead of us, the surface bulged. It did not break immediately. The sea swelled outward, a great rounded hump forming, the water sliding off it in narrow streams. It was as if something vast and patient rose, taking its time. Then the bulge opened. Flesh broke through, smooth and pale, marked with long, faint striations, like the grain of driftwood left too long in the wash. It rose higher, drawing in the green water around it, until at length the span of 3 kayaks lay bare above the surface. Along its top ran that same line of nodules we had glimpsed in the fog, each one throbbing faintly as if with its own life. Between them, the pits yawned dark. At the front of that exposed length, where one might expect a head, there was only a blunt, rounded slope. No jaws gaped, no teeth flashed. Instead, two great, lidless eyes looked out upon us. They were not the eyes of any known beast of sea or land. They were too large, too round, their surface a dull, milky white, crossed with a fine network of pale veins. Yet at their center lay pupils, deep and black, that did not reflect our small figures as animal eyes often do, but seemed to take us in and weigh us. Those eyes moved, not quickly, but with that same implacable patience. They scanned along the line of our kayaks, pausing for the space of a breath upon each man's face. When they came to me, the hairs upon my arms rose in a wave. I felt seen in a way that I had not known could exist. It was not the regard of a hunter for prey, nor the dull stare of simple curiosity. It was an attention that acknowledged us as separate, as other, and as something that might be measured, tested. Even as it regarded us, the familiar thrum rose through my hull, stronger now than ever before. It vibrated up my spine, into my skull, making my teeth ache. The sound in the air was low, almost below hearing, yet the water around the creatures rising back shivered with it. "Do not throw," Tatkek said quietly. His voice shook, but he kept it low and even. "You cannot kill what you do not understand." His words warred within me with the deep, drilled-in habit of the hunter. A great body lay before us. That body meant meat, oil, bone, all the things necessary to life. For a heartbeat, my hand tightened on my spear. Then those pale eyes shifted again, and the thought died. There would have been no point in casting. My harpoon, for all its hardened bone and barbs, seemed suddenly as harmless as a child's toy. The sea around the creature's flanks began to form small whirlpools, as if water were being drawn along narrow channels in its sides. Faint trails of that clear mucus spun off, catching the light. The smell thickened, pushing into my lungs with each breath, until I felt I was drowning upon dry land. We hung there, 4 tiny kayaks upon the heaving skin of the sea, before that vast, silent presence. Time stretched. My arms trembled from gripping the paddle shaft, though I had not yet moved. I heard Siku whisper something under his breath, his voice pitched high like a young boy's. Nulik's lips moved soundlessly, as if naming his wife and child. Then, without any change in its expressionless gaze, the creature sank. It did not dive in the manner of whales, but with a great arching of back and a proud rise of fluke. It simply lowered itself back into the water, the exposed flesh sliding down, down, the surface closing over it as softly as a blanket drawn over a sleeping form. The bulge vanished, the sea resuming its ordinary motion. In the end, there was nothing upon the surface but a few swirls of that faintly gleaming slime and a circle of oddly still water where the swell had yet to return. The thrum in my bones lessened, then faded. Sound returned to the world in layers, the slap of a small wave, the distant call of a solitary gull, the rasp of my own harsh breathing. My hands had gone bloodless upon the paddle. When I tried to loosen them, the skin cracked at my knuckles, and small beads of red rose, then washed away. For several heartbeats, none of us spoke. It was as if any word we might utter would be too small and foolish, like a child's label stuck upon the face of the moon. At last, Tatkek cleared his throat. "Home," he said. "We go home now." There was no argument. Whatever we had come to hunt no longer mattered. Our kayaks, built for these waters, now felt frail as eggshells upon an unknown current. The journey back to the village took 3 more days. The sea lay mostly calm, as if satisfied. The fog peeled back by slow degrees, revealing once more the sharp edges of cliffs, the familiar dark line of the far shore. Birds began to appear again. A lone gull at first, then a small flock of murres, then the rustle of plovers on the sand flats. Seals watched us from a distance, their round heads rising and falling, but they did not come near. Yet, for all that the outward signs of strangeness lessened, something in our small party had altered beyond easy repair. Siku's laughter did not return. When he spoke, his words were brief, practical, and his eyes often slipped away from the open sea to rest upon the shore, as if measuring the distance to firm ground. Nulik paddled with a slow, grinding determination, his gaze fixed always ahead, toward where he knew his home lay, though the houses were not yet in sight. Even Tatkek's stroke lost its former ease. There was a stiffness in his movements that had nothing to do with age. At night, when we pulled the kayaks above the tide and lay beside them, the usual snores and murmured dream words were absent. Sleep came in short, broken snatches. More than once I woke to find one of the others sitting up, staring toward the whispering line of water, his face pale in the starlight. I dreamed of eyes, not hunting eyes, not the bright cleverness of fox or mink, but those pale, lidless orbs that had regarded us without haste. In one dream, they hung above the village, looking down at the houses as the wind tugged at the sod roofs. In another, they lay just under the surface of the water in the harbour, watching the children at play. On the last day, we rounded the familiar headland and saw the dark shapes of the houses against the low sky. Smoke rose in thin lines. The cry of children at the shore carried to us, high and piercing. A loon called from the inner bay, its voice long and mournful. As we approached the beach, people came down to meet us, their parkas bright with beads and fur. My own wife was among them, her hair braided, our small daughter upon her hip. She smiled when she saw me, relief breaking across her face like sunlight. Behind her, at her skirts, my son peered out with round, solemn eyes. We dragged the kayaks up onto the stones, our limbs stiff. Children ran forward to touch the wet skins, to crowd around us with questions. Had we brought back meat? Had we seen whales? Had there been storms? Siku's wife reached him first. She touched his cheek with her free hand, then drew back when she felt the coldness of his skin. "Where is your laughter?" she asked softly. He looked at her, then away, and his shoulders sagged. For the first time since that rising in the water, I saw tears in another man's eyes. Tatkek went straight to the meeting house, his steps slow but steady. He entered without taking off his boots, a breach of custom that made the old women murmur. Nulik and I followed. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the smell of oil, smoke, and many bodies. The elders sat along the far wall, their faces turned toward us. Among them was my own uncle, whose hair had gone white. A few younger men stood in the shadows, their expressions curious. Tatkek did not bow. He stood before them, his broad shoulders squared, and said, "We have seen something in the southern waters that has no name." One of the elders, a man whose hearing had grown poor, cupped a hand to his ear. "Speak up," he said. "Did you say a whale drove your prey away?" "It was no whale," Tatkek replied. His voice rang in the low space like a struck stone. It rose from the water and looked upon us. It spoke without words through the sea and through our bones. It has passed along the coast, and where it goes, the animals flee. There was a rustle among the listeners. Some shifted uncomfortably, others snorted softly. "There have always been stories," my uncle said, his tone carefully even. "Spirits of ice and sea, beings of rock and storm. Men see strange things when they are hungry and far from home." "We were not hungry," Nulik said quietly. "We were not cold in our minds. We all saw it." He met my gaze and I nodded. My tongue felt thick and clumsy, but I forced the words out. "It left tracks upon the shore that no known beast could make," I said. "It has a smell like nothing I have known, and it moves with purpose. It is not a tale to frighten children. It is present in our waters now." For a long moment there was silence. The elders looked at one another, their lined faces unreadable. At last, the oldest among them, a woman whose hair was so thin that her scalp shone beneath it, spoke. "In my youth," she said, "my grandmother told of a thing that moved along the ice edge in the dark season. It had no proper name, so the people called it Palraijuk, the one that goes under. She said that when it passed, the seals left the breathing holes and the fish sank deep. Her cloudy eyes fixed upon us. We thought those old tales had died with the last who remembered. But tales do not die. They wait. Around us the murmurs grew. Some made signs against ill luck, fingers flicking quickly. Others shook their heads. "If this thing you speak of be real," my uncle said slowly, "what would you have us do? We cannot hunt what we cannot wound. We cannot move our houses inland. The sea is our life. We cannot turn from it because of one presence." His reluctance was not disbelief alone. It was the deep, practical resistance of a man who sees that to acknowledge a threat beyond his control is to admit his own smallness before it. I understood that even as I felt the weight of their doubt pressing upon the truth of my memory. In the end, they agreed upon words that would not trouble the sleep of children. It was decided that the story, when told in the meeting house, would speak of a strange whale that had frightened us, of odd currents, of poor hunting. The name Palraijuk was not used in public. That old woman's recollection remained a quiet whisper. Tatkek accepted this with a stiff nod. He was a man shaped by the need to live among his people, not to stand apart. Siku said nothing. He only sat in the shadow near the entrance. His face turned toward the door, as if he listened for a sound beyond the measured voices. As for me, I found that there were things I could not shape into any tale meant for many ears. The feel of that slick, cold touch upon my hand, the weight of that gaze, the way the sea itself had gone silent around us as it came near. These details I kept for myself and for those few who might one day ask, with eyes that told me they were ready to carry such knowledge. Years passed. Children grew. The Russians came in their ships of wood and iron with their crosses and muskets. Some of our people traveled with them, far along the Aleutian chain. Others stayed. The faces of my companions altered with time, lined by wind and worry. We spoke still of that voyage now and then, usually when the lamps burned low and only a few remained by the fire. Once, perhaps 10 winters after, I met Nulik upon the shore as the first ice formed in thin sheets along the tide line. His hair had begun to grey at the temples. His son, then nearly a man grown, stood with him, gazing out over the winter sea. "Does it still come to you?" I asked, standing beside him. He did not feign confusion. His gaze remained on the horizon. "In my dreams," he said. "Sometimes when the fog lies thick upon the water, sometimes when my son paddles out of sight." I think of those eyes then. They were not made for us, yet they saw us. Do you ever speak of it to him? I nodded toward the boy. Nulik's jaw tightened. No. What good would it do? If it never comes near him, he will carry no extra weight. If it does... He let the sentence hang, unfinished. There are weights that no words can lighten. Siku changed in other ways. He took to carving more often, his hands rarely idle, shaping small figures of bone and wood. Many of them were of ordinary things: seals, birds, the curves of women. Yet every so often I glimpsed another form in his hands, half concealed. Long and low, with rows of small pits along its back, and at one end a pair of round, blank eyes. He never finished these pieces. I saw him more than once throw them into the fire while they were still rough. He did not go inland with the Russians, though he might have. He stayed close to the shallower bays, where the water was greener and the bottom visible. When the young men spoke of hunting along the southern curve where we had gone, he would say, "There is nothing there worth the paddle," then fall silent, his lips pressed thin. As for Tatkek, he went on leading hunts for several more seasons. His stroke grew weaker, his gaze more often turned inward. When he died, he did so quietly in his sleep beside the lamp. Some said that the sea had finally called him home. I wondered whether, in his last dreams, he saw again that long pale back and those patient eyes. Years later still, when my own hair had grown white and my knees ached in the damp, a young man who had listened often to the Russians' tales came to sit with me by the shore. He had heard that I knew old stories, and he brought me tobacco in trade for them. His coat was cut in a new fashion. His knife had an iron blade. His mind had been filled with maps and distances measured in foreign words. "Is it true," he asked one evening, the dusk soft about us, "that there are great monsters in the sea that no man has yet taken? The Russians speak of such things beyond the far islands." I looked out over the water where the last light lay in a long, trembling path. A flock of birds skimmed low, their wings cutting the surface. Farther out, the swell rose and fell, featureless and calm. "There are things," I said slowly, "that live and move in ways the human tongue cannot hold. When men meet them, they give them names, but the names are only nets thrown upon deep water. The nets do not change what swims there." He frowned, impatient. "But are these things demons, or simply great beasts like whales?" I could have told him that they were no more demons than storms or earthquakes are, that they were not placed in the world for our benefit or our harm, that they simply were, as the rocks and the winds are. Yet even these words would have pushed my own shape upon something that had none we could understand. Instead, I said, "Once I thought that if I could see a thing clearly, I would know its nature. Now I have looked into an eye that held no malice and no kindness, only an attention as deep as the water around it. Tell me, what name would you give that?" He had no answer. He went away later that night to drink and laugh with men his own age, and perhaps to forget the weight in my words. I remained by the shore until the stars came out, listening to the small, familiar sounds of the sea. Yet, under those sounds, on some nights, I would still feel a slow, distant pulsing, like the echo of a memory in the bones. I never sought the Palraijuk again. To do so would have been to invite myself into a conversation for which I had no language. There were times when I considered traveling with the Russians, following the spine of the islands further east or west, searching for other traces, odd scars on whales, missing birds, empty rookeries, each time I turned back. The world had already grown wide enough with mysteries for one man's mind. In the dark of winter, when the wind pressed against the house and the snow hissed along the roof, I would sometimes wake with the taste of that sour, thawing smell in my throat. I would lie there, my wife's warm back against my chest, and stare at the faint shimmer of lamplight upon the low ceiling. In those moments, I heard again that nights sliding upon the stones, felt the weight gather just beyond my small circle of fire. Once, when my granddaughter was very young, I saw her playing by the water's edge in the brief summer dusk. She had gathered stones and was laying them out in a long, curving line that traced the shape of the tide. I asked her what she made. "A path," she said, "for the one that swims under the boats. It does not like to be lost." Her words chilled me more than any winter wind. I had never spoken to her of such things. Perhaps she had overheard bits of old talk, half understood. Perhaps children see more clearly the shapes that lie under stories. I only knew that, as I watched her small hands place each stone with care, the surface of the water beyond her lay smoother than it should, as if holding itself very still. In later years, some men wrote down parts of our tales, setting them upon the Russians' paper with clumsy letters. They spoke of sea demons, of hungry spirits that dragged hunters to their deaths, of warnings against pride. Or perhaps such stories served a purpose. Fear can keep a man cautious where courage would make him foolish. Yet what I remember most is not any sense of being hunted, nor any clear threat. It is the feeling of having the shape of one's world widened beyond endurance. To know that, just beyond the line where the known ends, something vast and patient moves with no need of our understanding. People like to think that the world has grown smaller now, that charts and iron ships and distant priests have pressed all mystery from its corners. But the sea, especially these cold grey waters, is deep in ways that no sounding line can measure. There are currents that run not only through water, but through time, carrying old presences along the coasts of many generations. When I walk now along the shore in the evening, my steps slow, my breath short. I still watch the line where water meets sand. I note the tracks of birds, the slide marks of seals, the small, neat prints of foxes. I look, too, for those broader grooves, those long, careful paths that come down from the upper beach and end with unnatural neatness at the wave's reach. I have not seen them again. Perhaps that is mercy. Perhaps it is only chance. Yet sometimes, when the fog lies low and the birds fall silent, I stand very still and feel the stones cold under my feet. And I hear from somewhere far beneath the everyday roar of the surf, a slow, faint pulsing that answers the beat of my aging heart. On such nights, the kelp along the tide line glistens with a thin, clear slime that smells very slightly of thawing ice.